Chair now recognizes Professor Manji for her testimony.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Irshad Manji, and I'm here in my capacity as founder and director of the Moral Courage Project. Before I formally begin, allow me also to express my sympathy to those, both American and not, who have been victimized by this week's violence in Libya, Egypt, and now Yemen. Housed in the Wagner School of Public Service, the Moral Courage Project teaches people worldwide to speak up when others, frankly, want to shut them up. We are motivated not just to break silences, but also to combat the abuse of power. In other words, the corruption that comes from the fear of speaking out. This means understanding why silences develop in the first place, which brings me to the question that concerns our hearing. Let me be clear. I do not know if one or more FBI officers intentionally withheld information about Major Nidal Malik Hasan. But personal experiences leave me skeptical about whether the standard bearers of national security are willing to share vital information, whether with the public or with each other. I will give you a couple of examples in a moment. First, let me address why I would have personal experiences on this front. And the reason is, I'm a devoted Muslim who loves God. And because I love God, I speak up whenever anybody uses Islam to violate all of our God-given liberties and human rights. As refugees from East Africa, my family and I settled on the west coast of Canada. And there, I grew up attending two types of schools: the multiracial, multi-faith public school, and then every Saturday, for several hours at a stretch, the Islamic religious school, the madrasa. At madrasa, I asked candid questions. For instance, why can't Muslims take Jews and Christians as friends? At the age of 14, having asked one too many of these questions, I got booted out of the madrasa. But as I've had to assure my mortified mother more than once, leaving madrasa does not mean leaving Allah. I decided to study Islam on my own and discovered that there is an Islamic tradition of questioning, of reinterpreting, and even of dissenting with the clerics. It is this tradition that empowers me to reconcile my faith with freedom. All of which puts me and my team on the receiving end of death threats and actual violence, not just in Muslim-majority countries, but also in this part of the world. And that is why I have firsthand experience with some of the inner workings of national security. And that is how I have come to observe the censorship that plagues many good people, people to whom we do owe gratitude, and whose mission is to protect the public. In my remaining time, I'd like to share two stories. And although the first takes place in Canada, of which I remain a citizen, it foreshadows the second story, which takes place in the United States, where I now live and work. In June 2006, Canadian police arrested young Muslims for plotting to blow up Parliament and behead the Prime Minister. The Toronto 17, as they came to be known, called their campaign Operation Badr, B-A-D-R, Badr. Operation Badr is a tribute to the Battle of Badr, the first decisive military victory by Prophet Muhammad. Now, police knew that religious symbolism helped inspire the Toronto 17. Still, At the press briefing to announce those arrests, police did not mention the words Muslim or Islam. At their second meeting with the press, police boasted, bragged about avoiding the words Muslim and Islam. Again, despite knowing that Operation Badr had been organized in the name of Islam. 3 months later, at a police conference, I raised my concern about the silence. After my plea for honesty, several law enforcement insiders, independent of each other, confided to me that the lawyers prevented these authorities from publicly uttering the words Muslim and Islam. As for my experiences in the United States, here's a concrete one. In 2009, I received media calls about David Headley, a U.S. citizen who helped plan the terrorist attacks on Bombay in 2008, in other words, the year before. Apparently, Mr. Headley had named me among his targets, too. Journalists wanted to know how that made me feel. You can guess my response. What made me feel worse, though, was that these media calls came in a full day before any national security officials got in touch. Somehow, somewhere, their chain of communication had broken down. The research on institutional silos and silence suggests multiple forces at play. But the antidote to all of these forces is moral courage, the willingness to speak up when others want to shut you down. I thank you for this invitation, and unlike my madrasa teacher, I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Professor, and we appreciate your courage. Thank you for being here. Chair now recognizes Mr. Leiter.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, it's a pleasure to be back. This is my first appearance before the Congress outside of the executive branch, and I have to say the freedom is rather invigorating. Today I'm actually appearing as a member of the Homeland Security Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center. That's the follow-on organization to the 9/11 Commission led by the very distinguished and talented Governor Tom Kean and Congressman Lee Hamilton. Although, of course, also my comments are really based on my time over 4 years as the head of the National Counterterrorism Center, as well as serving in the Navy and the Department of Justice. Now, rather than spending my 5 minutes now going over extensively where I think improvements have been made, I'd like to focus most of my comments on where I think there are still challenges that the Congress and the executive branch faces over the next several years. But I do want to highlight, because you're focused on a failure, Congressman McCall, you obviously noted the successes, and there really have been many. And many of these successes we simply take for granted today. The fact that we have a single consolidated watch list at the National Counterterrorism Center, the fact that we have analysts and information systems from a variety of organizations all in one place, the fact that we have 104 joint terrorism task forces and fusion centers. These are all, none of this is to say that the problems are solved, but this is to say that the improvements are quite tremendous. And the tragedy of the 13 brave Americans who were lost in Fort Hood can never be eliminated. All of that being said, that we have avoided large-scale terrorist attacks in the United States, and a total of 14 individuals have been killed in the United States in the past 11 years, is, in my view, nothing short of remarkable. Tragic that every one of those lives was lost, but a record which I do think that the Congress and the U.S. government and our allies can, in fact, be proud of. Now, having accepted that not everything is right, I would offer two caveats before I go into the areas where I think they can be improved. First, I think the Congress and the executive branch must be very careful not to conflate all information sharing problems as being the same. There is real sophistication in this. What happened on Christmas Day, an intelligence failure, was one type of information challenge, and it's a very different challenge from what happened at Fort Hood. And I say that because I think it is important to, as I say, get under the hood, examine these with some specificity. Second, I think this committee knows this well, but we have to continue to remember that that information sharing is not always an unmitigated good. We need look no farther than WikiLeaks to remember that as we share information, we must also do it in a way that not only protects privacy and civil liberties, but protects the security of that information. I believe these two things can be reconciled, but we cannot forget that there are dangers as well. Very quickly, where do I see some opportunities and need for improvement? And I'll divide it into 5 basic areas: legal, policy, budgetary, personnel, and technology. First, on the legal front, I am a recovered lawyer, but I will say there is probably no area in which I worked in national security where the legal landscape is a myriad of complicated, conflicting statutes. And it is extremely difficult to ever know how information can or cannot be shared. And the burden that puts on operators and analysts, not to mention lawyers, is tremendous. And although I think the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, serves some very valuable purpose, both for collection and for protection of civil liberties, anything that Congress can do to simplify that law, especially in an era of rapidly changing technology, would be critically important. Second, on the policy front, I think it is important that the Congress and the executive branch work together to move move information sharing policies in a far more rapid way than they move today. I think as a general matter, and I say this having served in a Republican and Democratic administration, I think as a general matter, administrations have gotten these policies right about how information should be shared. But the pace at which these discussions occur borders on the biblical. And in an era of rapidly evolving terrorist threats, we cannot allow these discussions to go on endlessly. The Congress must demand that the executive branch rapidly adopt policies like the Attorney General guidelines to ensure there's effective information sharing once laws are passed. On the budgetary front, this committee knows quite well the pressures that all of national security and state and local governments will face in the coming years. We have spent an enormous amount of money building joint terrorism task forces and state and local fusion centers. In my view, although these have done quite well, as we enter a more austere budgetary period, the Congress will have to look quite closely at how we can rationalize and truly create a national system and not simply a patchwork of entities. Very quickly on the last 2 points, personnel and technology. I think part of the failure at Fort Hood was undoubtedly a thorough understanding among some well-intentioned agents and officers about what were signs and symptoms of radicalization in the population. This sort of training must be continued, and of course, training on the tools that people already have must be increased. Last but not least, technology can help us here. We all know that technology is not a panacea, but basic technological tools which flag information for people, allow uncorrelated information to be shown to a variety of individuals, information to be shared across security regimes amongst the FBI, National Counterterrorism, Department of Defense, and the like, are absolutely critical. So it is not simply 2 agents looking at an email trying to decide whether or not an individual is radicalized, but we are actually taking full advantage of the larger national security community, and technology exists to do that today. With that, Mr. Chairman, I welcome your questions. It is very good to be back, and I want to simply close on joining you on your notes of condolences for the loss that we saw in Libya, the losses that we see every day in Afghanistan, and the losses that we suffered in Fort Hood.
I appreciate those comments, Mr. Leiter, and thank you for being here again. And I look forward to hearing the answers to my questions in a more open format without under the constraints of the federal government on top of you. So with that, I'd like to enter into the record a statement from the Honorable William Webster, the Chair of the Webster Commission. Hearing no objection, so ordered. I want to just show, not for any reason other than this was taken the day of the memorial service at Fort Hood. And you can see, I was standing here, but you can see the boots, the rifles, the helmets. It really gives you a graphic picture of what really happened that day. And you can see one of these soldiers on crutches. I asked him, What did he say when he shot you? Congressman, he said, Allahu Akbar, God is great. The classic jihadist terminology. At that moment, I realized that this was not a workplace violence incident, that this was something more, that this was, in fact, an act of terrorism. I was criticized at the time for saying that. I think history will judge that as a correct assessment of what happened on that fateful day. And Mr. Leiter, I want to start with you because you head of the NCTC, you are really the expert at connecting the dots. And you performed a masterful job while you were there. You and I have worked with Joint Terrorism Task Forces. They have an enormous challenge, an enormous amount of data that comes through, and many of which, if you miss one thread of evidence, you can be held accountable by members of Congress like myself at a later hearing. But these emails, the 18 emails that took place, when we were briefed by senior intelligence officials, and they wouldn't give us the content, they would just simply say, the only word I can use is downplay the significance of these emails. Finally, when the good work of the Webster Report revealed these emails publicly, we all had a chance to actually read the content. And the one that I described in my opening statement on May the 31st of 2009, Major Hasan, he almost seems to be telegraphing exactly what he's getting ready to do. Almost asking for permission from al-Awlaki in Yemen. Is it okay for a suicide bomber to kill soldiers and innocent civilians in the cause to protect our fellow brothers? You and I have worked in law enforcement. This is one of 18. The other one, here's keep me on your Rolodex, To me, this is a huge flag. It was a big deal in San Diego. The San Diego Joint Terrorism Task Force thought, wow, there's something wrong going on here. We need to start, let's send a lead to WFO. Let's have them investigate. The response from WFO is astounding. That, we don't really see a terrorist threat here. And they basically shut down this investigation until 5 months later when Major Hasan kills 13 people, 12 soldiers. There is a Department of Defense official on the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and yet that official didn't contact Fort Hood. Maybe it's the legal restrictions that you're talking about. So we need to change that. There were so many flags, not only between the FBI two offices, and I really commend the San Diego office for their courage and bravery of trying to get to the bottom of this. I fault the WFO office for not following up on this. And in the military, the way they pass this guy along, knowing he's proselytizing radical Islam. With business cards, soldier of Allah. He's enraging his colleagues, and what do? They just they don't want to deal with the problem. They went pass him along, promote him, send him down to Fort Hood. So many flags in this case. How could the dots were identified, but they weren't shared? How did this happen?
Congressman, I will say that I agree with you that it did not take long from my perspective to know that this is an act of terrorism. In fact, National Counterterrorism Center, within a week of the event, entered this into its worldwide database of terrorist events based on preliminary reports. And that was not a conclusive legal judgment, but certainly all the indications were that this was terrorism. I think in terms of the information that was not shared, you had a breakdown along so many different angles. Yeah. San Diego team, I think, did do a very good job, and I would defer to Mr. Winter, of course, who knows these details better than I, but they were not even aware of all of the emails. They were not aware of the Department of Defense information. WFO was not aware of much of that, and it was handed to an officer who, frankly, from an outsider's perspective, I think didn't have a really strong understanding of the signs of radicalization. Now, the 2 points I would make quickly in defense of how this evolved is, one, we do have to put ourselves back in 2009 to recall who Anwar al-Awlaki was then versus who he is perceived to be today. And in 2011, 2012, we understood him to be an operational leader in a way that in 2009 we did not. Now, that's not an excuse, but it is some color. The second piece is, from my perspective, Congressman, the idea that people would not go talk to him, I do not understand. And I do believe that if that information were shared with a broader group who understood radicalization, there would have been increased pressure from headquarters to make that happen. And that would have led to, I believe, a better outcome.
I can agree with you more. I talked to the commanding officer at Fort Hood, and wouldn't you've liked to have known this? Yeah. I understand fights are complicated. I understand, you don't want to shake down somebody, and they could have at least watched him, put him under some sort of surveillance. And just maybe that would have stopped, what happened. My time is limited. I do want to go to Mr. Winter. 18 emails. WFO only has 2 emails. Some technology breakdown occurs where they're not even aware. They can't even access. They don't even know how to access to get these remaining emails. And I have to say, Mr. Leiter, you as a former Justice Department official like myself, this May 23rd or May 31st email, if you read this, would that concern you?
Congressman, I look at one email and I look at the body of the emails, and to me, they are clear indicators of an individual who's been radicalized. Whether or not he has been mobilized to take action, that's a hard call.
But when he's asking permission to perform a suicide bombing mission against soldiers and civilians at a dinner to protect his fellow brothers.
As I said, that's why, Congressman,
yeah,
I would want somebody to go out and interview this guy who's clearly been radicalized.
And I think that's what should happen in this case. Mr. Winter, what happened here?
The decisions made in WFO were based on a cascading set of circumstances.
Your microphone? Yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry? Is that better?
Yeah, it is.
The decisions made at WFO were the result of truly a cascading set of circumstances. San Diego set this lead based on the first 2 emails that were acquired from Hasan to Alaki. There was no FBI policy on the assignment of these types of leads or on taking action on these types of leads. The supervisor in WFO waited 50 days after the arrival of the lead to read it and to assign it. He assigned it to a DCIS agent who was a task force officer. That agent waited 90 days from then to read it and to act on it. Under informal FBI practice, agents had 90 days to work on leads, either to elevate them into an investigation or to close them down. So this agent read that lead and acted on it on the last day under that FBI practice, and indeed conducted this assessment in 4 hours on that day. So it was rushed. There was that pressure that was created by their workload and these late assignments. He consulted U.S. Army electronic personnel files on Major Hasan. That was the entirety of what he, as a DCIS agent, could have access to from the JTTF. That meant he received a brief and highly misleading set of personnel records that indicated that Major Hasan had a security clearance. He had been promoted to major only 10 days earlier, and his supervisors praised him thoroughly. The only negative in those 80-some pages, I believe, was that he had failed his PT test.
They praised him, I think,
they praised his research on Islam in the military. Now, Hasan had used his real name in communicating with Alaki, so had not tried to render himself anonymous. The DCIS agent concluded, based on that this was part of Hasan's research on Islam in the military, and that the Army approved of it. At the same time, there was no FBI policy on what's called a baseline collection plan. That policy was instituted in September 2009 after this investigation, but before the Fort Hood shootings. That created a minimum of what agents are meant to collect when conducting an assessment. If that plan had been in effect then, this agent would have been required to consult the DWS EDMS system, which is the computer database on which all of the messages from Hasan to Alaki and vice versa were stored. Thus, he would have known of that, and he would have been required to search it. But he'd not been trained on that database. He didn't even know it existed. So what he believed after searching FBI databases was that there were only 2 emails, that they were sent in December 2008 and January 2009, which was 5 months prior, and that Alaki had not responded. Based on that, he concluded, and his supervisor concluded, that Hasan was not involved in, quote, terrorist activities. Now, did that resolve the question of whether or not Hasan was a threat? We didn't believe so. We felt that this decision-making process was flawed and that they should have considered and conducted an interview of Hasan based solely on the information they had at that time. But I'm not defending the decision. I'm explaining it. You can understand how reasonably these men could have been led down this path by the combination of all these circumstances, some of which were self-imposed, others which were the result of a lack of policy, others are a result of an inability to gain access to those records that Walter Reed, for example, had.
I think those problems need to be fixed. But I will ask you this question. Do you believe, I believe that gross errors were made in this matter that resulted in 13 people being killed, 12 soldiers. Should anybody be held accountable within the federal government?
On our review, we were specifically asked by Director Miller to assess whether any disciplinary action should be taken against any of the personnel involved. Although we found that mistakes were made, we found that these individuals acted with good intent, they acted mostly reasonably under the circumstances, and that they were not individually responsible for some of the decisions that occurred because of the lack of policy direction, for example. One of the reasons we advocated the 7 policies that we recommended was that if those policies had been in place, and similar procedures, then actions like this would violate them and individuals would be directly responsible and subject to discipline.
Is it your understanding these policies are in place now?
Almost all of the policies are in place. They're not, some of them are being coordinated into a single policy, the command and control hierarchy, for example.
Yeah, my time's kind of running short, but on the Senate report, they indicate the San Diego office calls WFO, and the response back is, look, we don't want to damage his stellar career, and something to the effect of this is a politically sensitive matter. That was not corroborated by the WFO office. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But according to San Diego, that conversation took place.
The first part that you discussed is corroborated, that WFO advised San Diego twice that they did not believe an interview of Hasan was appropriate because it would damage him in terms of his position in the military. The chain of command would not take it lightly. I
do think that the American people and the families and the victims deserve that somebody in this government be held accountable for what happened. Professor, I want to ask you real briefly with my limited time left. You spoke very eloquently of your experience of a fear of speaking out. Within the Department of Defense, you know, we have this individual that various of his colleagues are seeing these warning signs popping up. They call him a ticking time bomb. He's proselytizing radical Islam, talking about Osama bin Laden, having business cards that say soldier of Allah. I mean, so many indicators are there, and that no one wants to speak out. There's a fear of retribution within the Army, and he's just sort of passed along. Is this a case where political correctness was more important or overshadowed national security?
It sure sounds like that. If you can hear me, it sure sounds like that. Thank you. It sure sounds like that, Congressman. And frankly, I think it would be fair to ask if political correctness also crept into the FBI. For example, we've spent the last several minutes talking about how somebody at the San Diego office of the FBI had a troubling lead, passed it on to the Washington field office, after which it went nowhere. And one of the questions I have as I'm listening to these other testimonies is, why did the San Diego officer not stand up when it became clear to him or her that an obviously unsettling lead was not going to be acted upon.
Yep.
Now, one can argue that, well, it's obvious why people don't stand up in general, because doing so invites complication in your life. And life is complicated enough. Thank you very much. But this is where I believe we can actually learn something about a mechanism that the Department of State has put into place. And that is a mechanism called the dissent channel. And it was actually introduced just after the Vietnam War, whereby foreign policy officers, when they see that the chain of command is going to be resisting their dissent with groupthink, with the subtle consensus that has been accepted for too long within the cozy confines of that department, they can actually use this dissent channel to explain why somebody higher up needs to hear a counter-argument, and they do not have to get permission from their higher-ups in order to be heard through this channel. I don't think that exists either at the Department of Defense or at the FBI, but it's something well worth investigating. Whether it works, as it did, by the way, in the lead up to the Balkan genocide, and it was, one could argue that was the reason, because at the time, Secretary of State Eagleburger heard a dissenting voice through that channel and realized that the United States must intervene. It was through that I think we can learn a little bit more about how dissent can be institutionalized so that it is constructive rather than chaotic.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. Chair now recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I think you've done a good job of looking historically at this. I want to come at this at a different angle. Maybe ask Mr. Leiter first. I've heard about the policies. I've heard about some of the changes. Could this, under the same set of circumstances, happen today?
Congressman, you'd end up with a slightly different set of facts that wouldn't quite fit the policies that you put in place. But I think that they're...
All right, forget the policy, just the circumstances.
I think it's less like... The more it looks like this circumstance, the less likely it's going to occur. But could something like this fall through the cracks? Absolutely. I still believe that there is information that is not being shared effectively, and quite often that information is about U.S. persons, which is appropriately the most protective set of information, and the Congress and the executive branch must ensure that that information is effectively shared. So as the professor very ably said, you can get second and third opinions, and you aren't simply forced to take the views of one operators or one analyst about whether or not someone is a threat.
Mr. Winter, could this still happen today?
Absolutely. And I agree with Mr. Leiter. The closer the circumstances to those of the Hassan matter, the less likely it is to happen, because of the policy changes, because of the higher sensitivity to these types of issues. For example, however, two of our recommendations concern the FBI putting into place a clearinghouse process by which it currently has with DOD, by which it advises DOD through headquarters and through the National Joint Terrorism Task Force about investigations of DOD personnel and the military. We recommended that similar clearinghouse procedures be adopted for law enforcement agencies whose members may have equal, if not greater, access to weapons and intelligence than military members, and also as to other departments of the federal government, so that if someone at the State Department is under investigation, there is a mechanism in place for the investigating officers to move that up, not only up the FBI chain of command, but also move it to the State Department chain of command and their investigators, so that all the individuals can work together to detect and deter the potential for terrorism. However, obviously, outside of government hierarchies, the possibilities for individuals like Major Hasan to take these kinds of actions exist. And it is difficult for the FBI to have constant knowledge of the whereabouts and intent of those types of individuals.
Well, one thing that I wasn't going to ask this, but you sparked this interest. I've asked it with General Barry McCaffrey before. that initial information, getting to whether it's local or state officials usually, how is that inhibited by not having a comprehensive immigration policy in the state? If people see things, if people want to come forward, how are they going to come forward if they are going to effectively make themselves criminals? How weak is that in the initial information?
That's something that is slightly beyond my pay grade, sir. I would try to answer in this fashion, however. The FBI has in place what's known as an e-Guardian system, which is an electronic version of its Guardian system by which individuals who bring information to local law enforcement agencies, let's say, even anonymously, tips and the like, can be forwarded on immediately and promptly by electronic means and acted on by FBI agent reviewers and analysts, I should say, within a very short period of time.
Yeah.
Congressman?
Assuming they did that. Yes, Mr.
I think interaction with immigrant communities is critical. And in the counterterrorism context, obviously what we're most focused on is American Muslim communities, which may or may not be immigrant communities. But engagement by the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, immigration, a wide range of agencies, and state and local officials with American Muslim communities is absolutely critical to occur, not just for law enforcement intelligence, but for good government and engagement. And I will say that Congress has an important role in that regard, that when the FBI does engage these Muslim communities, that they are not immediately second-guessed about which Muslims they talk to. It is very important for them to have wide engagement to understand these communities and potentially identify individuals who have been radicalized. And in my view, the Congress has to give the executive branch a reasonable room to maneuver to do that engagement to find problem areas.
Yeah.
May I add something of my own in this regard?
Just briefly, yes.
Sure. Of course, engagement with communities of all kinds is necessary for good governance. The problem is that too often, especially in this country, we stumble over ourselves to try to identify who are the moderates and who are the extremists. And I would argue to you, gentlemen, that this is the wrong distinction. The better distinction to make, if you want to really get at the heart of the matter, is who are the moderates and who are the reformists. Moderates, for example, don't much differ from extremists in that moderates are so consumed with what they perceive to be Western imperialism, Israel, America, so forth, that they have distracted themselves from dealing with the imperialism within their communities. Those clerics, those imams, and even those supposedly secular civil leaders who insist that good Muslims remain silent when crimes such as honor killings happen within their communities. And so we need to ensure that we get the framing here right if you're actually going to hear people who are willing to step forward. But they're not going to be willing to step forward, Congressman, unless they know that you've got their back, because they know what backlash is coming their way by virtue of having opened their mouths.
Thank you. I just want to get back to the process itself, too. One of the things that you said, Mr. Leiter, that concerned me is, because we hear it all the time, in this committee in particular, in different shapes and forms, but you use the word, the necessity of having a national system versus a patchwork system. To me, we could have the greatest information in the world coming forth if we don't have a way to process that on a national basis. Can you really talk more specifically about what you meant when you said that? I mean, how far along, all of DHS is patchwork as far as I'm concerned. It's amazing. And we haven't gone past jurisdictional issues and done some of these things yet. But to me, that has to get fixed first. Now, I know we have budgetary issues in front of us, but if that's not fixed and that's not a priority, what good does all this gathering of information, what good is it? So when you said that, I think that's a priority that we have to have. And what budgetary issues are confronting that, and what actual technology issues or interaction issues with different levels of intelligence? Expound on that.
Congressman, absolutely. We obviously, as both you and the chairman know well as attorneys, we live in a very federated system. And as we built up these state and local fusion centers with hundreds of millions of dollars, That information is being collected at the local level and to some extent shared with the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI through the JTTFs. But what we have not done is created a system where you can actually effectively compare that information across state and local fusion centers, across JTTFs. Now, I think the FBI took a very, very valuable step in the past year, which is to move towards a regionalized structure, because I don't believe that you can have any system with 104 JTTFs and 50-plus fusion centers and actually see correlations quite effectively. So a regionalized intelligence structure where you have, I believe it's 6 or 8 regions that are looking at the various state and local fusion centers and JTTFs and seeing where there's suspicious activity or where there's a FISA intercept of import. And then having those cases managed by the FBI headquarters, that in coordination with DHS, that starts to look like a system. And as you see that, and as that information is shared within the federal family, with the National Counterterrorism Center, with Homeland Security, who's specializing on borders, using their collection resources at ICE and Customs and Border Protection, you start to understand how you can close these gaps and, as you so eloquently stated at the beginning of your questions, try to avoid this from happening in the future. As budgets go down, weaving this together will be more difficult, but absolutely the technology exists today to make sure that some of those less understandable correlations are seen both at the state level, at the local level, and ultimately at the federal level for some of these cases.
Just the last quick question to yourself and Mr. Winter. Would you say that's among the top priorities right there in having that occur?
Yes.
I absolutely agree. That was the first of our information technology recommendations to the FBI, enterprise data management.
Great. Thank you very much. Now you back.
Thank the ranking member. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Duncan, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for this very timely hearing. You know, the State Department had warnings at least 48 hours in advance of the 9/11 attacks that happened this week. Yet they did not go in lockdown in certain embassies where the threats were. And the reason I say that is that a lot of times we are given very, very clear signals staring us in the face, and we fail to act on those, or many times we lean back on political correctness, as Professor Manji pointed out, the religious symbolism, the Operation Badr. They didn't even want to discuss the real ideology behind a certain terrorist attack. The fact that we have here in America taken to calling Fort Hood a case of workforce violence or workplace violence, but yet we will call what happens in Wisconsin an act of domestic terrorism. I'm alarmed and really raise awareness here in this committee of some of the things that I hear going on within our Pentagon and within the military, where servicemen and women are discouraged from pointing out things that they see, such as what happened at Fort Hood with the SOA on the card, and just signals that are very clear for people that are going through their daily routine that should raise a red flag for us. But yet they're scared they're going to be labeled as an Islamophobe. And I think when we have hearings within this committee addressing Fort Hood or addressing the radicalization of Muslim youth, it's not an address of Islam. It's more of an address of an ideology that is really encouraging folks that practice Islam as their religion to embrace a certain set of ideals and ideological values that lean more toward the attacks that we see. And I think that's what happened. Major Hasan was caught up in that. But as Americans, we can't be afraid to speak out. And I want to thank the professor for having the courage, the moral courage, to speak about those differences. And that's what I heard today about the difference between Islam and your practice of the Islamic religion, but also the fact that there are some folks that do practice that religion who have gone in another direction in another part of their life and their political ideology and what their world vision is. And so one thing I want to ask all of you is, following the findings and recommendations of the Webster Report on the Fort Hood attacks, how would you categorize the attack that occurred at Fort Hood. Mr. Winter?
We discussed this question at length. I speak for the Commission in our unanimous view, and our view was that we saw evidence, but we did not have the opportunity to investigate on a criminal basis as the U.S. military is doing.
Well, let me ask this question in a different way.
We don't know.
Workplace, workforce violence, or domestic terrorism?
I've heard that, both of those characterizations, and we refuse to reach a finding on that. And I have to say the reason is that we don't have the evidence sufficient to know. We don't know what kind of standard Department of Defense is applying. Certainly our investigation was not into Department of Defense activities. And it was not into the criminal investigation itself, which was to a great degree hands off to us because the military is pursuing that criminal case against Major Hasan. So we were unable to reach a decision on those issues. We do believe and really would like to see justice done for the victims, their families. Their
I'm going to end this dance. Professor Manji?
Domestic terrorism, homegrown.
Thank you. Mr. Leiter?
Congressman, the analysts at NCTC within a week, as I said, deemed it to qualify as an act of international terrorism under the statute that we use. It was a subgovernmental group, political violence. We called it terrorism then. I call it terrorism today.
Okay. I want to refer back to the chairman's opening statement. The men and women that stood at Fort Hood at that ceremony, ones that were wounded in that attack, the families of the victims of that attack will tell you to this day that this was an act of domestic terrorism in the war against terrorism. I think we as America need to set aside political correctness and really be able to discuss the real threats, existential threats to our way of life. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Yeah, gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly want to thank the witnesses for their participation and especially for their insights and their answers. I was thinking that, we can always know what happened because we have the information. It's obviously far more difficult to determine why it happened or the causes that may have generated or caused it to take place. Mr. Winter, let me ask you if I could. You indicated that policies are that investigators and agents have 90 days to work on leads, and that sometimes individuals have more call for activity than time, or there's not enough personnel. There are so many leads until trying to follow up on all of them. Are there thresholds that will jump out at you? I mean, if you're reviewing tips and information and allegations that a person can just kind of see that this appears to be over the line and we need to try and check it out as quickly as we can?
Yes, there's a significant amount of training on many different levels on how to deal with tips, information, intelligence of different kinds. Here, the San Diego agents recognize that the messages deserve some form of action. Under FBI policies that then existed, they could set what was called a routine discretionary action lead because there was no indication of anything imminent, something that required a 24-hour or 48-hour response. That meant it was a routine lead, which would be resolved in the ordinary course of business. It also meant that the WFO would exercise its discretion on how to handle the lead. The 90-day period that was in existence was an informal FBI practice at that time. We have, of course, recommended that the FBI establish periods within which leads must be acted upon. The FBI, in turn, has also eliminated these discretionary action leads and has required action on all leads that are set out from other offices.
Let me ask each one of you if you think that we do as well as we possibly could in making assessments of individuals when they're going to be placed in certain kinds of positions relative to evaluation as people seek employment, as people take assignments and have access to certain kinds of opportunities. Do we assess their personalities, or do we glean enough information where it gives a comfort level in terms of where they are and what they might be doing?
Congressman, I'll answer on two pieces. First, I think we probably all, as bosses, interviewed someone, given them a job, they had glowing recommendations, and then they come and work for you, and the performance ain't so glowing. So this is a pretty broad problem, and obviously the manifestation in this situation is absolutely tragic. The second piece, though, more specific to terrorism, is the FBI does have an incredibly difficult job of distinguishing those people who are radicalized and have radicalized views and those who become mobilized and actually take a terrorist action. Again, that's why you want people to go out and interview them and try to make that determination. But frankly, if the FBI, with all its resources, if you used everyone in the federal government, they couldn't watch everyone who was just, quote-unquote, radicalized. They've got to prioritize. And making that determination is very hard before the fact and looks very, very easy after the tragedy.
Or even people who might seek to become members of the FBI, to be in a position to carry out their ultimate aim. And so all I'm really seeking is opinion. I know that it's tough trying to deal with motivation all of the time. I mean, if we could answer that, we'd be in very good shape.
Congressman, if you'll allow me one quick intervention, I've written exactly about this question of what to ask in order to conclude within the Muslim communities of this country where people stand on the continuum of reform, moderation, extremism. And I would be very pleased to submit to the committee the specific questions that I recommend be asked.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and just let me close by, well, first, let me thank you for this excellent testimony, and I do think, I agree with you, Mr. Leiter, that, the FBI, JTTFs have an enormous challenge. So much information is coming through, and you miss one thread, and then you're held accountable. I think this case, though, I would make the argument is a little different. You've got a major on base, Fort Hood, who's talking to a cleric who there was some evidence that may have even had ties to the 9/11 hijackers, for God's sakes. And he's really rising in stature to becoming the number 2 in the world, next to bin Laden. And I think, and unfortunately, WFL only gets 2 emails. They don't get the May 31st email that clearly outlines what his intentions are and what he's planning to do. You're right, Professor. San Diego has it, though. Why, and they have DOD employees on these task forces. Why didn't one of those at least contact Fort Hood? Why didn't anybody contact Fort Hood and say, you know what, there's an issue here. You got a problem. You got a guy that could actually kill somebody, And I don't think any of you really have the answer to that. I don't have the answer to that. It's just unfortunate that it didn't happen in this case. And so with that, again, let me thank you for your brilliant insight and your excellent testimony. And I'll dismiss this panel and move on to panel 2. Thank you.